Right then. Hello, everybody. I'm going to start now because it's just gone 8 o'clock. My name's Tim Frenno. I'm the founder and curator of Adventurous Inc. And it's amazing to have so many people here. This is, in all the years we've been doing this, this is only the second one which is sold out. So for those of you who are watching on catch up, who gave your tickets when I sent an email around this morning asking if you weren't going to be able to join us to give up your tickets so I could invite other people, thank you very much. They all appreciate it very much. I hope you enjoy this in the after whatever it is when you watch something again. We are in for a cracking conversation this evening. I really can't wait. All the books that we feature, they're worked through. So the authors have these fabulous experiences out there in the wild, and then they spend days, weeks, months, years, even in Andrew's case, working through what it all means, and then they refine all of that wonder down into these magnificent tomes, these tiny little books, and all that experience packed into that little book, and we get to enjoy it, and life is so much more richer for it. So it's great to be able to delve into some of this. So this evening we're joined by Andrew Terril, who's the author of both of these books up here. The first one, The Earth Beneath My Feet, which we featured last year, and the latest one, On Sacred Ground, which is our deep read at the moment, which tells the tale of his 7,000-mile journey through the wilds of Europe, completely pathless. We'll get into why it's such an amazing tale and an amazing journey in a moment. We've also got Chris Townsend and Alex Roddie. Andrew and Alex have been with us before. This is Chris's first time, so please be gentle with him. I can't promise to be gentle with him. No, very gentle. So the way it works, I ask most of the questions, but if there's any questions you'd like to ask, please throw them in via the chat. You know what it's like. Until someone asks a question, it's all very quiet, and then it goes hell for leather. So we'll see how it goes. I will field in the questions as they come in, but I can't promise to ask all of your questions, just because it can be a bit difficult, and we can interrupt the flow. But it's as much your conversation as it is mine. So do throw your questions in. So Andrew, on the 1st of May 1997, he began his longest journey of them all. He set out to walk solo and unsupported across an entire continent, aiming to visit 8 countries, travel 4 distinct mountain ranges, and endure 8 seasons, carrying everything he needed on his back.
And a lot more than I needed too.
Yes, the size of your pack is quite a thing. We'll talk pack sizes. I'm going to make a note of that because I think it is quite funny.
Do we have to? Do we have to? Because it's genuinely embarrassing looking back at it now.
Well, it was a long time ago, wasn't it, Andrew?
That's what it was.
We didn't have the lightweight gear that we have
now. Hamish Brown, when he did his first round of all the Munros in, when was it, Chris? 77, 74?
74, I think.
Right, he was out there for 3 months, and obviously, being Scotland, the weather was appalling, and he was in places essentially as wild as I was, and his basic pack weight was probably a fifth, a sixth of what I was carrying at some points of my journey. So,
yeah, his basic pack weight was 23 pounds.
Okay, so a quarter.
And he said it once went up to 30 pounds when he had to carry a week's food. And that's the heaviest it ever was.
So I think that kind of confirms that although I was out in winter and that was slightly different, but I think blaming it on the gear of old is stretching the truth. I made some decisions which were fine by me at the time, and it added to the journey, I think, rather than detracted. But that doesn't change the fact that I still cringe whenever I look at the photos, and cringe even more when, the subject comes up. So, it was what it was.
You sparked a memory there now, and I can't remember who it was, and I'm guessing that one of the three of you remember. who was the backpacker whose luxury item was one spare sock so that you could rotate it? Does that ring any bells with anyone? I'm sure someone's.
Yes, I think that was one of the Crane brothers. I think when they did their run stroke backpack across the Himalayas, they said they only carried 3 socks, and you swap one sock to the next foot, and then you took one off and put the other one on, washed one sock, and did the process again.
Oh,
so you didn't need more than 3 socks.
That's masochistic even by my standards when I'm in an ultralight mood.
Certainly it is by mine, yes.
And there was me with 9 books in my rucksack at one point, just because I wanted to reread them. So
it's see, I knew you would know. So we've got hiking luminaries with us here. So Chris, as he says on his website, is a passionate enthusiast of wilderness. Spent much of his life exploring the wild places. Long distance hikes his particular delight. He's completed many long distance hikes, and he set out to communicate his feelings about nature and the joy it brings through writing and photography. He's written 25 books, co-authored and contributed to many more, and it has been a long-standing gear editor for the great outdoors. So that must make you wince then, Chris, when the only bit of gear that someone needs is a 3rd sock. I mean, that's not going to sell many magazines, is it? Have you ever tried the 3rd sock gear edit?
No.
Of all the socks you could have brought, and Alex, of course, is another contributor to the Great Outdoors magazine, editor of Sidetrack magazine himself, another photographer. We've got 3 photographers here, 3 writers, 3 long distance hikers. So we couldn't have a better cohort of folk to talk about the incredible, the incredible delights and wonders that come from just putting one foot in front of the other. So I wondered, I've introduced Andrew's tale there of 7,000 miles from the southern tip of Europe to the northern tip of Europe. I've not really come across much like that. Alex and Chris, do you know many other people who've set out on such crazy adventures as this?
I can't think of many in recent times, no. I mean, you do hear about people who go on kind of very long bikepacking adventures, but in terms of hikes, I can't think of any recently. And certainly not with the kind of almost kind of like purity of purpose that Andrew had in his journey. I don't know about you, Chris.
Not that length, no.
No.
I mean, there are a few. Andrew Skirka here in the States did a 7,000-mile walk. I think it was, I forget the name of the trail now off the top of my head. It was along the top part of America, but he spent 9 months on it. I think someone recently did a walk all the way up the eastern side of the United States from the tip of Florida all the way up to the Appalachian Trail, and then all the way on beyond the normal terminus of that was a similar distance. So there are a fair number of people who do it, and I think a lot of them are kind of unsung. They may post about it on social media and not write a book about it for whatever reason. For example, Nicholas Crane pioneered a route across Europe, east to west, west to east, 3 or 4 years before I did my trek. So, I don't think it's as unusual as all that.
No, you've named at least 3 different other people who've done it in the entire 8 billion people on the planet there. Andrew. I mean, it's not unusual at all. Not unusual at all.
Well,
but I think the crucial point is that for most of those people, Nicholas probably accepted, you talked about them walking on trails, and you weren't walking on trails, even paths, were you? That's, for me, that is the absolute wonder of your journey, is that you were just walking north. I mean, so you went where you wanted to go and found a level of freedom that none of those people who are following a nice waymarked trail can ever find, and let's face it, a level of difficulty as well. But it's pretty unprecedented. I think you're being very humble there.
Yeah, I mean, my purpose was to find the wilder spots, and most of them are off trail. Sometimes I meant to be off trail. Quite a few times I wanted to be on trail and ended up off trail completely by accident, and benefited from it and struggled from it. But you know, in some ways, walking in Scotland, as Chris knows, you get used to venturing onto rougher grounds and realize that the best parts of nature are those where you don't have the line defined for you by a trail someone else has blazed. When you start to pick your own path. I mean, Chris did a walk in the Yukon, which was very much an off-trail adventure, right, Chris? And so you've experienced that, you know, finding your own way in a landscape in a very real way.
Yeah, very much. And as you had in quite a few places, without decent maps either. So to some extent, the maps were such that you looked at them and thought, well, maybe I can get out the end of this valley, but the map doesn't tell me enough information. So yeah, it is very different doing a walk like that. I mean, I think on that walk, there were trails for maybe 5% of the journey, mostly at the start. And after that, it was very much, well, nobody walked there. So I didn't meet a single other walker, I think, for 2 months until I got into what for the Yukon was a relatively popular area. And then I met two.
Wow.
Amazing.
That's out there, isn't it?
So to me, walking where there aren't other people it is a completely different journey from walking where there are established trails and people, and it's the same level of difference as walking alone on a long journey for 6-8 weeks, whatever, is as different from walking with even one other person. It makes it just such a different game, and you have such a different level of connection with the environment you're passing through and with yourself.
On your journey, Andrew, there were times when you reveled in that, and there were times, I think, when you realized you missed that, didn't you? Do you want to read that? Have you got the bit that we talked about after Robin had left you? Do you want to give us a quick read of your experience when you realized that was what you were supposed to be doing after Robin had left you?
Sure, I will try. As the ex-stammerer in me, quakes a little bit about reading out loud with people listening in. But then, the whole journey, in some regards, is about stepping outside your comfort zone to a degree and doing things which scare you. So this is a perfect example of that. So here we are. See, I can't even start. Robin departed early the next morning at 1:30 a.m. This time, wonderful as the companionship had been, there wasn't even a slight loss of balance. Instead, energy coursed. I strode swiftly from the station, hungry for the wild, determined to make every second count. After Richard and Tanya's departure, the purpose for being on the walk had blurred, but now it was startlingly clear. I knew what I wanted, what I was in Norway for, what I was alive for, to live each moment to the full. I knew in which direction my path through life was supposed to head, forward. Suddenly I found myself awash with freedom, blindingly aware that I, and I alone, was in control of my life's journey. Even of this particular physical journey, the walk was nearly done. A thought struck that I could so easily have missed this. I could have gone through life unaware that I had control, but I hadn't missed it. I had everything I needed right here with me. And the greatest thing was I'd still have it back. I'd still have it even back in London. I didn't want to run out of funds, but if I did, it wouldn't be the end of the world. I paced into the new day, celebrating all the lessons I'd learned. There, that's the thing you wanted, right?
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. I find myself awash with freedom. And at which point in the walk was this then, Andrew? How long had you been out there by this point?
That was about 1 year and 2 months into it, roughly. Prior to that, I just discovered I had about 2 weeks worth of funds left in my bank account. So I thought I was about to fail because I didn't have the funds to finish it. And I'd been through 1 or 2 ups and downs to that point. I'd suffered a bout of losing balance after a couple of friends had joined me and then they'd gone. And I realized that going through life on my own without a partner was not necessarily a natural way to go through life. But then I returned to nature and discovered the balance I was seeking again. And so everything was finally starting to come together with me being in the place I wanted to be, doing the thing I wanted to do. And it was made all the more powerful by the fact that at that point from that exit, I thought I only had 2 weeks left.
Wow. And so, you know, I think I can go for a walk, and in the woods that's 5 minutes from my home, I think I can lose my everyday concerns and find myself in nature and find a sort of fulfillment. But there you've reached a complete different level of awareness and connection, I guess. And I'm interested in all of your thoughts about the time it takes being out there before we shift to a different state. Does it happen in hours? Does it happen in weeks? How long do we have to be out there before we find that different state?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, it's around about 2 weeks in general. Like, I think it depends on the frame of mind that I take with me into the trail that I'm doing. So if I know that it's going to be a shorter route, then I find I can slip into something approaching that state of mind in only a few days. But for the longer routes that I've done, around about 2 weeks, and I find my mind starts to slow down and just become less, I guess, scatterbrained and flitting from thing to thing. But it takes a while to get there, and you know, you have to let it happen. You can't force it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's about the same for me, roughly 2 weeks. But as Alex just said, as you can't force it, sometimes it comes more quickly, sometimes it doesn't. But certainly I'd say at least a week before all the little niggles and concerns at the start of the journey, both about the world you left behind and all sorts of minor things to do with finding campsites and food and, you know, will you be able to buy supplies? Is the route finally going to be difficult? These all fade away because once you've been out for 10 days, 2 weeks, you've got into the rhythm of doing those things and they're no longer on the surface. So you can then start to appreciate, you know, what your journey really is about and take them for granted. But yes, it does take a while to get into that certainly before I feel I've really begun now. You know, the sort of breaking in stage of this walk is over and now I'm actually doing it and I don't have to think about all these things.
And when, I mean, it's a question for you all really, when you get to that stage, when, as Chris said, when you start to realize what the journey's about, what is that?
Oh, that's a difficult question, actually. Yeah. I'll let Chris answer first.
Well, for me, it's about experiencing where I am and moving through that environment, through nature, and feeling part of it. One of the things I find, oddly enough, that disappears after the first 2 weeks are any concerns about completing the journey, because suddenly reaching whatever the end point is doesn't matter anymore. All that is a convenient point on the basis that I know I have to stop sometime. and I've set this arbitrary mark as, well, that's where I'll stop. But what's important is what happens on the way to that stop. The stop itself, and whether I get there or not, suddenly seems immaterial, because each day is for itself and each day is different. And I'm not usually thinking beyond, at very most, where will I be this evening? I mean, one of the things I don't like to do, and I know some people do this, but is too much planning. I don't like thinking, this is where I'll camp. First night, second night, third night. I don't do that. It'll be, well, I know roughly how far I've got to walk before I'll need to buy some more food. So I've got, X number of days to walk 150 miles. But how many miles I'll do each day and where I'll camp each night depends on how I'm feeling at the time. Because one of the things, Andrew's in his reading talks about freedom, is the freedom that a solo walk gives you. Mm. And I don't want that freedom restricted by, well, I have to get to this point. I want the opposite, which is, this is a really beautiful spot. And it may only be 2 PM, but I'm going to stop and camp here because I want to spend some time in this place. Or conversely, walking till after dark, camping where I'm not really sure what's around me, but I've got a bit of flat ground and some water, waking up the next morning and thinking, wow, this is a fantastic spot. I'm not going to move on for a bit. I'll stay here during the morning and just potter about and, absorb and appreciate where I am before moving on. And being able to do that is an important part of a long walk for me.
Yeah. Tim, my answer to your question, I think it's the point when whatever journey you're on becomes your life, and the life you left behind before you stepped onto a path or a trail or no trail has completely faded away. And so I agree, like for me, it used to take days or weeks to get to that point. But because I'm lucky enough to live right underneath a mountain, and because I've been out, I feel like I've been out so much, and I kind of have a daily nature habit. So I step onto rough ground every single day. I feel like there almost isn't a transition, because being out in nature is such a part of normal life now that that is my life, and there isn't a transition from the cares of the world. It's all just mixed together, if that makes sense. Like I set myself a little task last year of sleeping out 52 nights. I was 52 years old. There are 52 weeks in a year. If I could sleep out 52 times, it seemed like a nice mini journey I could do without disrupting my wife and kids too much. And doing it, going out every single week, just made being on foot, pitching a tent or unrolling a sleeping bag beneath the stars became such a normal part of life that merging into that place of being in the moment, as strange as and unlikely maybe as it sounds, was essentially instantaneous. And it was a wonderful thing to feel. And perhaps I didn't quite reach the levels of over the top euphoria that I described in Arctic Norway and Sweden in my book. But there's like this still deep well of connection and of everything being absolutely right that accompanied those moments.
That's interesting that you say that, because not everyone will know listening to this, but at the moment I live in Lincolnshire, which is a very long way away from the mountains. But I am in the process of moving back up to Scotland. It's happening next week, so excited about that. But I think that's one reason why for me it takes a while to get back into that frame of mind, because the area where I live is quite nature deprived. There are some fantastic little secret hidden spots of wildness, which was something I really identified with in Andrew's books, actually, just being able to see what's actually there and being able to see the secret stuff that other people don't see. But even so, it does require quite a mental shift when I go into the mountains. So I've sometimes wondered if that's why it takes me a little while to readjust. And it's almost as if I'm kind of putting on a different hat and becoming a different person. And And I think as well, it depends on the goal of the particular trip. So for some trips, it is very much about that sense of simplicity and slowing down that Chris mentioned. But other trips for me are quite goal oriented, because like all three of us, I write about my outdoor adventures. Sometimes I've got a schedule and a brief and brands to keep happy and whatnot, and that does tend to get in the way. But then again, there's a different form of enjoyment from that, and it's kind of completing a project. And so yeah, it's not a simple thing, even though when it gets to that point, it can feel like a simple thing.
That's why it was interesting in A Short Walk in the Hindu Kush, how from my reading of the book, and we all interpret these things differently, I didn't at any point see that connection with the land, with the landscape, with himself, that we've referred to. And partly it was the style of a journey, the fact that he wasn't solo, the fact that it was so uncomfortable. And of course, it actually, compared to the kinds of walk that Chris does and we've all done, it actually was a short walk. So maybe he didn't have the time in his journey. But it's interesting. See, I really think you need to go solo to really get that deep connection. And Eric Newby was only on his own for a few hours at a time in that journey.
Oh, yeah, completely agree that there's always kind of chaos going on, and people, that there's always so much that he has to attend to, and everyone's always got dysentery all the time, and it's, like it really must have got in the way of event. But there are moments of it though, aren't there, when he's high up on the mountain, and he's just like little glimpses of it. But I think that's all you really see.
Right, and it might be his writing style, because he was writing a comedy book to some degree to entertain and play down certain aspects of it. I mean, he had that moment of happiness when they left Nuristan and dropped back down into the civilized world, where he had that, he called it extreme happiness.
Yeah.
And I've definitely felt that in that way, when you've done something really difficult and challenging, and then you're suddenly descending back to easier terrain, that happiness washes over you. It's like a mixture of relief and a sense of accomplishment. But that's very different from the level of connection that we were talking about, or I think we're talking about. Well, I know that I'm talking about.
I tend to agree, and part of me wonders as well if it's kind of the fashion for outdoor writing in the 1950s that was maybe seen as a bit too kind of emotional, and I mean, obviously there are exceptions to that, but part of me wonders if it just wouldn't have been as kind of fashionable or marketable at that time, to even if he had felt those emotions.
Oh, I think definitely, given it was written early 1950s, and if you read and as a mountaineering story as it's presented, you read other mountaineering books of the time, including the Ascent of Everest is the obvious one, but some of the others as well, and they're all very factual, goal orientated, dry. It's all about, we are here to conquer this mountain. That's what we're going to do. This is how we did it. And the only emotion that comes through is ones of triumph when they succeed. There's very little else. I mean, compared with those books, Eric Newby's book is actually very emotional, because in those books, they very rarely admit to any sort of disagreement with anyone else. I mean, we're all good British chaps. We do not argue all stiff upper lip stuff. I mean, they're much more like Thesiger, in fact, than they are like Newby. But that was very much how mountaineering books, were written. So to some extent, I think Eric Newby is aware of that, and he is gently mocking those books with his humor, and with the fact that, as is absolutely clear, they are not competent mountaineers. In fact, they're not really mountaineers at all. One of my favorite bits of the book is early on, when they realize that maybe having some climbing instruction or experience would be useful, before they go and climb a mountain in the Hindu Kush. And they go to North Wales to do some basic rock climbing experience, which just shows, you know, how little they knew about what they were going to do. But I do think that's one of the best passages in the book, when they get, you know, these instructors in North Wales who must have thought, these guys are completely crazy. They're going to do what? You know, and they don't know the basics of rope work or rock climbing or anything.
And I think the moment when they meet Thesiger, it kind of sums it up, because, you know, he says to them, "You must be a pair of pansies," as they're getting their airbeds out, and that's those two different worlds expressed right there, isn't it? That one comment, "My God, you must be a pair of pansies." I mean, you know, that's it, isn't it? But you've absolutely nailed it, and that's one of the reasons. Well, it's the reason why I wanted to feature the book, because we all in Adventurers Inc. we always steer clear of those conquest myths, those macho, triumphant, "I've defeated this," the goal orientated stuff. I don't think it takes us anywhere, and that's why I wanted to feature the book, because that was one of the first stirrings of a different approach to it. So yeah, he doesn't experience any or share any of those connections or those emotions, but he set us on a path that has very much got us to the point where we can share that, and we can relay that, and we can look for these deeper experiences in the natural world. There was something in Hindu Kush that Chris's comment earlier actually reminded me of, and it's possibly because I've not read lots of the older mountaineering literature, but I thought it was fascinating that they were measuring their distances in farsangs, which was the distance that you could. So it was a village was 2 farangs away if it was 2 hours away. And so they were measuring distance in a completely different way. It was how far you can walk in a certain amount of time, rather than this meter of how far away it was. And that struck me as really interesting and actually a lot more relevant. And that speaks a lot to some of your experiences, actually, in that the distance and the things don't matter. It's really about the time that's spent immersed in that environment and how far you can go. And it did make me think that, particularly in this day and age when we can map everything, can't we? We know exact distances, and so you get locked into it's you know, today's going to be a 20k day or whatever, and that number is there, as opposed to a different experience, which is, well, how long is it going to take? Will we get back before dark? And it's much less numerically driven, I guess.
That's interesting, because I don't know if it's still true now, but 20 years ago, for a few years, I led treks in the Himalayas. When I say I led treks, I was the European leader. The Sirdar actually led the treks and organized them, told me what we were going to do, and I told the clients what we were going to do, you know. But it was done exactly the same way. The Sirdar and the Sherpas never talked about distance or speed. It will always be, we will stop and have lunch in 2 hours. We will be at camp in 4 hours. But it was always done on time, never how far it was. And sometimes if one of the clients would say, "And how far is that?" they looked baffled. They didn't know. It wasn't relevant how far it was. They knew how long it would take to get there. And ones which the Sherpas did quite subtly, but once we'd been out for a couple of days and they'd worked out the speed of the group and so on, so the plans would be revised to take that into account. But it was done, say, exactly the same way as it is in Eric Newby's book. And this was in, you know, the early 2000s.
Chris, I bet it's been a fair while since you measured or even cared about the distance of most of your outings, right? It's probably something you haven't really thought about, except when you're writing a magazine article or looking back at something for a book. It's probably been a long time.
I had to do it recently, and I realized that I'd stopped doing it because my last book, I agreed to do a guidebook to Torridon and the Northwest Highlands. And of course, for that, the publisher required exact distances for all the walks. And even the ones that I already knew very well, I wasn't quite sure. I thought, well, I think it's about 10 miles or whatever. And I had to do them again. But these days, of course, you can have a machine record it for you. So again, you don't have to think about it. You just look at it at the end and say, oh, actually, it wasn't 10 miles, it was 12 and a half or whatever. But no, I don't usually. And again, as you've got, as you said, the Rockies on your doorstep, I've got the Cairngorms on my doorstep. And because they're hills that, I go to regularly, usually, unless I'm away, at least once a week, it's all familiar ground. I don't think about distance. I think, where haven't I been for a while? Or where do I feel like going? Oh, I'll wander over there and so on. But partly it is the familiarity. I don't need to look at the map and think, can I get there and back in a day or 2 days? Because I already know.
It's a useful part of getting older, because I've noticed that I've really started to slow down in recent.
Andrew, what are you saying?
Sorry, it's my apologies. I thought you'd finished, Chris. I apologize.
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. You're alleging that Chris is getting older.
No, I was going to say I've noticed that I have slowed down significantly in the last year or so for different reasons, and it's actually very nice to not know that I'm walking a lot shorter distances than I used to, because I haven't measured distances for years and years. So there's no black and white evidence now that I'm turning into a slower sort of walker.
It's interesting because, of course, I'm in my mid-30s, and I also have the dubious honor of being the Great Outdoors magazine's resident tech geek. So this means that I get to review all the GPS watches and smartphone apps and all these kind of things that are designed for outdoor use. And I feel this, I find this a real double-edged sword. So my background is in computer science, and I find it really interesting looking into all this kind of stuff. But also, all of this technology is very distance and metrics oriented. So in recent months, I've been going out on walks and runs with a number of GPS watches strapped to my wrist, and they always give you the exact distance to within, 10 meters or whatever. But the thing that I've always find really interesting is that it's different for every device. They never agree. And this always kind of leads me to think, well, do you even really need to know, if they can't even agree? And particularly things like the number of calories burned on a walk. I really do think it's completely pointless. They can't even remotely agree how many calories you've burned on a walk or a run. So what's the point?
It wasn't quite in the same context, but in one of our conversations a couple of months back, Amy Jane Beer talked about the Stravafication of the outdoors, and I thought that was a lovely term to describe it. And it detracts from it, doesn't it? And it takes away that being present in it when you're just trying to tick off a distance or a personal best or any of those things.
Yeah, for me it does, and I think partly it's because I'm so immersed in this tech a lot of the time for my job. I find that I have to step away from it for long periods. I mean, like my book is partly about my relationship with technology, but I do think that most of these devices, even in as much as they can be quite useful in certain circumstances, they're much too complicated for the average user. There is not a single one that I would say is optimally designed for hill walking. They're all, 600% too complicated, and that very complexity detracts from the experience of being outdoors, which at its heart is quite a simple experience. That's my take on things as somebody who struggles with technology in general and its place in my life and in the outdoors. Everyone's going to have a different perspective on this, though.
There's a lovely comment in the chat from Norman. So in terms of measuring distances, he's shared the term. My pronunciation, I apologize for it. Kusma, which is a compound of poron, reindeers, and kusma, peed by. So it's the distance a reindeer could travel without stopping to urinate. There we go. There's a good measure. That feels a more connected measure for distance, doesn't it? What a brilliant measure. I wanted to, there's one other distance related thing that I really took from Andrew's book, and it was the way that you slipped into the landscape, and just by traveling for such a long distance through so many countries, passing so many borders, you realized that they're just man-made things, social constructs of a line on a map that when you're out there don't really mean anything. And that's, you know, granted, land use can change as you move across the border, but you seem to have almost like an overview effect, like you'd been into space and you'd looked back down because you trekked for this distance that those borders became immaterial. And I thought that was wonderful and magical, really.
Yes, see, for me, I got lucky, and I think the length of the journey did change my perception of being outdoors in nature going forwards, regardless of how long future journeys would be. I think it was just because I was out for so long, you know, month after month, through spring, summer, winter, then spring, then summer, and then heading back to the next winter again. It took me to a place that I hadn't reached on my previous long journeys. You know, I'd had a 6-month walk prior to the one, you know, from Italy to Norway. And although that had some amazing moments of connection and, you know, the usual range of highs and lows, it didn't take me to the place I was lucky enough to get to on the walk across Europe. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write a book about it, because it was that little bit more unusual in the places that it took me to, and I just thought they were worth sharing.
I mean, absolutely. And again, I think it speaks to what a remarkable journey it was. I'm guessing, Alex and Chris, you must have experienced something similar, if not on the same scale, where these, again, I suppose it's all the same thing, isn't it? It's the constructs that we structure our lives around suddenly sort of dissolve into meaninglessness whilst you're out there and finding something else.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I think for me, the 2 walks that I've done have kind of really brought this home. So I think the first time I really experienced this was when I hiked a route called the Mercantour Traverse in south of France back in, I think it was about 2018. Just a few days, but it did a lot of border hopping between France and Italy. And as you'd expect in the Alps, the terrain was exactly the same on either side, but the border was kind of studded with remains of old World War II fortresses, barbed wire, all that kind of stuff. And it was really almost kind of ridiculous standing on these border ridges, seeing the same forest on both sides. You know, wolf packs would move from one valley to the next, and then there's all this rusting barbed wire. And exactly the same thing happened to me last summer. I did a big, well, I guess it was fast packing route across the Alps from Ventimiglia to Zermatt, a bit of running as well as hiking, and mostly following a route called the GTA, which Andrew followed part of in his journey as well. So I was partly following similar areas to Andrew. And yeah, exactly the same thing. French-Italian borderlines, ruined fortresses, gun emplacements, barbed wire, old minefields, tank traps, everything, you name it, from both world wars. And it's all just kind of rusting into the ground now. And the landscape's the same on either side. And this is like a really abiding memory and image for me from that trip. It's just the kind of irrelevance of human borders, and the fact that they change as well. You know, people were fighting and dying to move these borders, in some cases tiny distances, and then a few days later something would change and the border would move back, and it just kind of makes you reflect on the irrelevance of it and the tragedy of it as well, I suppose.
Yeah, for me, the same experience is slightly different, but of going completely into the unknown was when I did the Pacific Crest Trail in 1982. Now, today, it's a popular trail and there is masses of information about it. You can find out just about everything, every mile of it, the whole way. In 1982, long before the internet, of course, there was virtually no information. I had never been to the USA. I'd never been walking outside of Britain except for one trip with friends to the Pyrenees. And now I was going to the Western USA to walk this trail no one had ever heard of from Mexico to Canada. And I started off at the Mexican border, going into what is desert country without any awareness of what I was letting myself in for. But in terms of borders, the only borders I crossed were between states. There are 3 states on the Pacific Crest Trail. But the attitudes of people was interesting. Southern California, when I told people I was doing, and I say, no one had heard of the Pacific Crest Trail. Very few people walked it who had heard of it. So locals had never heard of it. And they all thought, who's this crazy Brit come over here to do something impossible? But they would all say to me, you're finishing where? And I'd say, well, up at the Canadian border in Washington State. You're going all the way up there. It's cold up there, you know. They have snow all the time up there. And anyway, I've heard the people are a bit weird. You want to walk out when you're up there. I realized I was getting towards the end of the trail when I was in Washington State, and people said, you've come from where? And I said, oh, California, the Mexican border. And they said exactly the same thing. What, you got through there unscathed? It's dangerous down there, far too hot. And anyway, I heard the people are really weird. What are they like? And in both places, and the people wanted, and they really wanted to know what was Southern California like. Because of course it was 2,000 miles away. And they'd never been there. They only knew what they saw on the television. So to talk to someone who'd walked from there, and it did make me realize that, you know, even within a giant, well, it's a giant country, but USA, there are borders and there are differences. And one of the things which I know from his book Andrew found is when you walk for a long time, many months. Now, the longest walks I've done were that one and the Continental Divide Trail, both 5.5 months. So nothing to compare, you know, with Andrew's marathon, but still long enough that you see the changes in nature as you go along. And you realize these changes, you know, as the desert flows into the foothills, and then the Sierra Nevada and the snow, and then into the forests of Northern California, and then you get into the volcanic regions of Oregon, that the borders don't matter. Where one state begins and one ends doesn't matter. And even at the end, you get to the Canadian border, and to finish, you have to go, or you did then, a little way into Canada, because it stops as a border marking. There's nothing there. There's no roads, there's no buildings. There's just a pillar with Canada on one side and the USA on the other. But nothing changes when you walk into Canada. You can walk all the way around that pillar and go from the USA to Canada, the USA to Canada a few times, and it's exactly the same. You're in a forest, and the forest doesn't care whether it's in Canada or USA. But I did find that that's one of the things, particularly with a long linear journey, so that it is changing. You know, the southern area, the deserts of Southern California and the forests on the border with Canada are very, very different. And you feel at that point, you know, you've come a long way. You have made a journey through time, through space, and also within yourself, because I think when you do a journey that long, you're not the same person when you finish it.
That's very true. I was a lot stinkier when I finished.
Oh, yeah, so was I.
Yes, see, on my walk across Europe, and the landscape variation from southern Italy to the top of Norway, you know, so many different kinds of environments, and admittedly, most of them had been affected by humankind to some degree. You know, the influence was there, whether I was aware of it or not, but there were so many different ecological zones. And even the part of a journey where I got to walk alongside the North Sea, by the endless sea stretching on one side and the sand dunes on the other, that added such another rich dimension to appreciating a whole continent and a sense of place. It was it was the variety from being on a long linear journey, the way Chris says, that really added to the full experience.
And it's interesting that we've heard about the people over there are strange, and journeys like these allow you to puncture those little bubbles that most of us live in, and it enriches everyone who reads the stories. And that's one of the many reasons why I love sharing these books every month, because there's so much there that we can take from them. And I think you've done such a wonderful job of describing that, Andrew. I think you really do transport it. You've saved us all the job of walking 7,000 miles, so thank you for that.
That's the last thing I wanted to do. Everybody should go out for a long walk, even if it's just for 2 hours this afternoon or tomorrow morning.
No, but I think you do. It does inspire that. I'm kidding, but I think. I mean, I have to say a big thanks to Alex, actually, because it was Alex at the end of our conversation when we'd featured his book, The Furthest Shore, who mentioned your book and in such glowing terms that I knew we had to feature it. So what was it that you saw in? Was it the journey, Alex? Was it the writing? What was it that when we were talking about other great books that you thought, actually this is the one that I want to recommend?
Oh, I think with Andrew's books, to be honest, I'm going to make him blush here, but I think it's a bit of everything. Good. So like I've read quite a lot in this genre, and I've edited quite a few books in this genre as well, and like Andrew's books, they really are the finest books that I've edited. I say that to a lot of people. They have absolutely everything that you could wish for. And when Andrew first approached me, he said, I think maybe these books might be a little bit long. I think maybe we need to shorten them slightly. But as I went through, I realized there was really not very much that you could shorten. I mean, not without harming the essence of the books. And that for me is the sign of something that's really, really well written. And it's also because obviously he's been working on these books and he's been thinking about them for such a long time. Every word is so well considered. So I considered it quite a responsibility to edit them. There are other books that I've edited where I've cut 20,000 words. I'm pretty sure we didn't approach anywhere near that on Andrew's books.
In actual, I owe a debt to Alex for suggesting several key parts of the book that weren't in there and needed to be added. So Alex made such a good contribution to making it a better rounded story than it was before he took a look at it. So yeah, I asked you, let's shorten it, because people are going to complain when they review the book that it's too damn long, and a few people have, but most have said actually, I wanted the book to be longer because I wanted to stay immersed in the journey. So yeah,
absolutely. It's for me, it's the right length. I think if you cut bits out, then you start to spoil the message.
Yeah, purely as a reader, with no editing or anything else, but just reading the books, there was no point where I ever thought this is going on too long, or I want to skip through this bit, it's not interesting. Everything fitted together and the whole thing flows. So I would agree they're the right length. They could have been longer, but definitely not shorter.
Yeah,
thank you. I am blushing. Thank you.
I mean, it's really hard to write well about long distance walking. Not everyone can do it, because ultimately, when you're when you can't just write about somebody taking one foot in front of another. There has to be a deeper story there. And I've read manuscripts from people who've tried to write books about long distance walking that just haven't had that spark. And if it doesn't have it, it doesn't have it.
and likewise, and that's you know, I guess I'm the luckiest, or one of the luckiest people in the world, in that that's my job. I get to read all these books and find the best ones, the ones that have got that meaning hefted into them, that as a reader you can take from them. So
I have to interject there, Tim, because it's a really important point that you described yourself as the luckiest person on the world with your job. And I know that's slightly tongue in cheek, but you're lucky because you made the choices you made to create this business that you're running. So luck actually has nothing to do with it. And I counted myself fortunate that I was on my long journey. And then I realized, well, actually, it's not good fortune. I've made choices that have taken me there. And I think that's such a key part of the kind of journeys we take. We deliberately choose to head out into the mountains, to have those experiences, to put life in perspective, to make those connections with the world and with ourselves. And it's the deliberateness of that that is such a critical component of it. And it isn't like the old school mountaineering, I must get to the summit of Everest and shout about it. I think these journeys work best personally for those who take them, when it's just, I'm going there and I'm choosing to go there, and this is what I'm doing with my life. So sorry, I just had to say that when you said I'm lucky.
I agree. I think you're absolutely bang on. Life is all about choices, and for so long we can go through life without making choices. And I'm glad I've made the choices I've made. I don't think my bank manager's quite so pleased, but hey, who's ever bothered about pleasing their bank manager? Certainly not me. Somehow we've got 3 minutes left. So honestly, I've got 2.5 pages of questions. We've not even done half a page of the questions. So like Andrew's book, this conversation could run on and on. I would encourage anyone, if you've got any questions, throw them into the chat. We've got a good one from Marion, who wanted to talking about how you write the books. She said, how do you revive your feeling of being out there, those feelings, when you're back home writing the books? And particularly for you, Andrew, because I'm not sure everyone realizes, but it was, you know, there's 15-20 years between the experience and the writing of the book. So how do you bring those feelings, all of you, into the books when you're sat at your desk writing them?
Well, I can answer for me very quickly, in that the experiences were so intense and so different from normal life that they remain inside as though they happened yesterday. And I mentioned that at the end of the book when I was talking about how I wrote it. To recall the emotions of it, it really took no work at all, because it was still there, a part of who I was, a part of who I am now. You know, it really hasn't changed. I could close my eyes and look a bit strange probably on screen, but step straight back to so many parts of that journey and relive them. I imagine as intensely as I lived them when I first experienced them. And that's one of the beautiful things about being out in nature, is the moments are unique. They don't blur together and become forgettable the way our routines in normal life so often do.
Oh yeah, I very much know where you're coming from there. I think for me, I can get into that state where I can remember things naturally, but I need a bit of prompting to get there, because my memory is terrible. So I find that if I don't have a photograph of something, I tend to forget it. So I take a lot of photographs. And for me, when I'm going back to write about my experiences, I will spend a lot of time in my Lightroom library. And also I keep a detailed journal, although not as detailed as the journal that Andrew kept, it must be said. Although some trips I keep a more detailed journal than others. I think the best one I kept was when I hiked the Haute Route Pyrenees a few years ago, and I wrote about 2,000 words per day at the end of every day. And that was an amazing experience, and it helped me actually to understand what I was experiencing when I was on the trail as well as afterwards, because for me, you know, walking is very much the same thing as thinking, but also writing is as well. So I'm one of these people who doesn't really know what I think about something until I've written about it. So photographs and writing, and if I've got the time on a particular trip to write a detailed journal, then that really, really helps.
I keep a detailed journal as well. And yes, I can remember lots of the intense moments of significant walks. I mean, the Pacific Crest Trail, there are still moments of that. As Andrew said, I can close my eyes, I can be there again at various points of that journey. However, I didn't write my book on the Pacific Crest Trail until over 30 years after the walk. It would have been a much shorter book if I hadn't kept a detailed journal, because when I reread my journals, I have to admit there were parts of the journals I don't remember this at all. I have no memory of this happening, but I wrote it down, so it must have done, so it's going in the book. Whereas the intense periods, I didn't need to look at my journals. There were certain points, there were certain things that happened, you know, either exciting or spectacular or frightening, that I can still remember absolutely clearly. But they have become almost the whole walk for me. And because it was 5.5 months, there were other bits of the walk that had faded. And of course, this was in film days. If I was doing that walk when I do walks now, I take hundreds of photographs, because with a digital camera and a smartphone, you can. But when you're carrying the film and you're buying the film and having to send it away and have it processed, you don't. And one of the things I found, yes, when I wrote my Pacific Crest Trail book, when I forgot occasionally that there was no digital, then I was cursing myself. Why didn't you take a photograph of that? Why didn't you take a photograph of this? And then I remembered, because I was carrying films and I was limiting to myself to a film, 36 shots maximum a day, because I wanted the films to last until I got to the next place so I could get more film. So I had to rely on, you know, my journals. But yes, I can go right back into parts of that walk, and they could have happened yesterday.
There's a great question from Peter on the chat, who asked if any of you kept an audio journal or any audio recordings, and would it have been any better or worse for doing that?
Yeah, I was just about to mention that, actually. That's an excellent question. I do that quite often, but not with every trip. And I find that it's really, really good for the kind of quick notes that I do throughout the day. So when I'm actually walking, sometimes I'll carry a little kind of waterproof notebook in my pocket just for jotting down the little things that have happened. And then in the evening, I'll transcribe into a proper written account. But quite often I will just take voice notes on my phone. And for example, for recording conversations, it's absolutely brilliant. And also sometimes just, you know, you arrive in a bothy, there's nobody else there, and I'll just set the phone on record and I'll just kind of talk, just say whatever's on my mind into the phone. And quite often I will forget all about it, and then years later I will stumble across this recording, and that is the most surefire way of getting me straight back into the frame of mind I was in at that particular moment, because you've got all the background sounds, you've got the howling of the wind, dripping of water, etc. And it's like nothing else. It's really amazing.
There's another good. I know we passed our hour. I'm sorry. I'm going to ask. I'm going to ask this final one more question, or maybe a couple more questions, and then we're going to wrap it up. So sorry if you're missing the end, if you've got to leave. Guys, are you all right for another couple of minutes?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we're
going to wrap up soon, I promise. But Norman's asked a lovely question about how we throw a lot of modernity into at walking, from your 6 watches to Dyneema tents and carbon poles. But to what extent does the simplicity of the basic process engender a kinship with, when he says traditional nomadic people, I would extend it to a kinship to everyone. I mean, walking is one of the most common things that we share. So do you find that? Do you find it extends that kinship, that deeper connection to other people's experience?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is something I often think about when I'm walking. It's long distance walking is something that prehistoric humans would have done all the time. When nomadic lifestyle was quite simply the norm, and it does give you a glimpse into that way of life. Particularly, I think in the British Isles, where you will find tumuli, standing stones, stone circles everywhere, and quite often you will find that people lived in the uplands far more than they lived in the valley bottoms, and you get to thinking about how people lived in completely different ways in prior centuries. So yeah, for me that is absolutely the case, and I do find sometimes that the technology that we take does get in the way of that understanding, at least for me.
One of the things I find with long distance walking is, as I said, I think at the beginning, the technology dominates at the start. But once you're into the walk, one of the things is I take it for granted. The technology are just tools that I'm using to do the walk. So I don't think anymore about, what do I think of this tent? It's just a tent and I'm going to put it up in the evening and sleep in it. And the same with the other gear. And that's one of the, I think, the nice things about a long walk. But the other thing, which may be how other people relate to walking, is on all my long walks, wherever they've been, I've always found that I would say 99% of the people I've met have been friendly and helpful. Wherever they are, in towns, people you meet, in the hills, you go into places and chat to people, they're interested in what you're doing. And I mean, I learned this. My first ever long distance walk was Land's End to John O'Groats in the UK, long before, again, there were guidebooks and so on, who suggested routes for it. And I set off without really knowing what I would encounter. And people were really helpful. I learned I could arrive, if I wasn't sure, I was in farmland, and I thought, I need somewhere to camp. I'm not sure about this. Wander into the local pub and start talking to people. You wander in with a big rucksack. People start asking you what you're doing, and you say, well, actually, at the moment, I'm looking for somewhere to camp. And suggestions will come flying, and people will offer places. I mean, the best one of those, which somewhere in the Midlands, was the publican said, oh, you can camp out the back, and I'll leave the back door unlocked so you can come and use the loo. And just like that. And people who trust you on the Pacific Crest Trail, when I was hiking with two people and we got into this town and we thought it had a campground, it didn't. We were walking around trying to find somewhere to camp. And this guy who was getting in his car, so three guys with big packs walking down his suburban street, asked us what we were doing, and we told him, and he said, oh, you can camp in the back garden. I've got to go to work, but use the house. Here's the keys.
Wow.
And he came back that evening, and it was great. But I found people like that everywhere. And it seems to be something about, if you're doing a walk, people somehow relate to that. If you turn up in a car, you're not going to get the same reaction at all. It'll be like, well, you can drive somewhere else and find somewhere to stay. You've got a car.
Yeah. And Andrew, I wanted to finish with you, because it strikes me, and I think you reflect on this in the book, that physical act of walking is a very natural thing for us to do, and it takes us into a place where we can reflect about what's important in our lives, and it's almost taking us, shedding off those cocooning layers of modernity and getting back to the real essence of what it means to be human. That was, for me, that was the deep message that came from everything that you had in your book, and I can see it was such a profound feeling for you, more than just an insight.
Right, and that completely echoes to what Chris and Alex have said. I mean, Alex said walking is thinking, and it's exactly the same thing. I think walking predates language, it predates civilization. It is what we've been doing for 200,000 years. And it's one of the reasons why it feels so good to just go out and do it. And it's not something that even has to be analyzed or defined in any way. It's just such a, being in nature on foot, moving through it, and then stopping and engaging with it is such a critical part of what we are as a species. And it's why there are so many problems in the world, because the majority of our society has moved so far from that.
Absolutely. Well, amazing. There's a comment in the chat. Sue says the solo female might not have quite the same experience about encounters with us. I fully accept that we've had 3 white blokes talking about this. Hey, I'm there. That is a conversation that we're going to have definitely this year, Sue. So we've done that, and it's a conversation we've had as well. Guys, what a fabulous genuinely. I've got pages and pages of questions I've written nothing on them because we've not got onto them, because it's been such a beautiful, deep, rich conversation, inspired by your experiences, which I know will inspire all us to get out there. That's why I love doing this. The books that we read inspire us to get out there. They inspire us to reflect on the things that are happening around us and to reconnect with what's important. And that's what it's all about. And we couldn't ask for better ambassadors than the 3 of you. So thank you once again. Thank you for all the books. Thank you for the recommendations. I hope we get to do this again. I'd quite like to carry this conversation on. So let's see if we can find a way to do that at some future juncture, because it's been a joy. Thank you, all 3 of you. Thank you, everyone else as well. It's been brilliant. I know we've had some new folk. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation this evening. We do this every month. I mean, this is it. This is what we do. So yeah, you're always welcome. And hey, you know, we send books, and that's the way it works. And it's a good thing, because let's face it, we all need a bit more books and a bit more inspiration to get out there in our lives. That's never going to be a bad thing. Right, I'm going to take us off pin. We can all do that wavy goodbye thing, and then well, we'll say goodbye. And there we go.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great, and let's do it again. Yes,
absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye now.
Bye. Bye.